think it was early last week, I was sitting at home and thinking, and looking at, we've got a series of talks on speech, and wouldn't it be good to have titles for these talks? And so I thought, what could I call this talk? And given that the sort of real crux of the talk is about listening, I thought, well, listening's got to be in the title. And also, I've got this sort of slightly ambiguous sort of deep listening, and I hope that's going to become clear over the course of the next while, exactly what that might mean. And then I thought I'd add in this thing called myth. And I'm also aware that the word myth in English has got at least two different meanings, radically different meanings, one of which is one of falsehood. So if you think I'm going to be a deep listening denier, that's not going to be the case. This is very much a myth in a very different sense. So when I think of myth, I think of something like the Greek myths. So I think of, it reminds me of change, of transformation, and journeys. Typically, I mean, I suppose the arch example is the Odyssey, in which Odysseus returns from Troy to his native Ithaca in the Mediterranean. So it takes him however long it takes, and he goes through various adventures on the way. So it's got the sense to me of change, maybe even of transformation, of journeys. So I thought I'd start tonight off with a story, and this is a true story. It happened, a story that happened a long while ago, and it's okay for visuals. So yeah, so it's a story that happened a long while ago, 1986 to be exact, and it's probably September time, 1986, and I'm living in London. So this particular evening finds me after I finished work, and at that time I was the accountant for the Carronite Trust, which was based in a place called Dalston, which is near Stoke Newington in North London. And I lived in a Buddhist community in Hackney, near Clapton Station. And I had an appointment to meet somebody in the old Docklands, down, you know, well south, just north of the river. And so I'm going to have to get there. And I don't think I had access to a car at the time, so I was going to have to take the old London buses. So if you ever see an old film of London, you see those big double-decker buses, the big red buses, the route masters, I think they're called. So if you can imagine, I'm sort of finishing work and then getting on the old route master, and perhaps after a series of route masters, finds myself down in the Docklands into a working class area where I'm meeting a person that I've both never met before and know actually very little about, though we're meeting by arrangement. My job when I get there is I'm going to have to elicit a story from this person. And the story I'm going to have to elicit from her is the story of her husband dying. So what's happened, I can't remember now because it's so long ago, how much earlier the husband had actually died, but it's probably a few months, but it's causing problems for her. So my job is to elicit the story, establish what problems actually this is creating other than the sort of normal bereavement type issues that one might expect. Ascertain whether I can actually help her to deal with these issues and suggest how I might do that and arrange what we would call a contract. So I have an hour to do this in. If you're wondering how I know all about this, obviously I've received some training. So what had happened a while earlier, a voluntary organisation called the London Hospital Bereavement Service, which is based obviously at London Hospital on Myland Road. I think it's now the Royal London Hospital. I'd contacted various organisations, including London Buddhist Centre, which I was then involved with, asking for people to volunteer to become counsellors. So I think 4 of us put ourselves forward. And so in addition to the actual journey I was having to make to get to this lady on this particular occasion, I'm now sort of going to subject myself to a very different sort of journey, which is the journey of training in bereavement counselling, which started off with having to fill in quite a substantial application form when it felt like you had to sort of revisit virtually every aspect of your life. And then you had quite a rigorous interview. And that was just to get onto the training itself. And I think that sort of consisted of several weekends, intensive weekends, after which you had an assessment. So the whole thing was quite rigorous. Everybody, as far as I can remember, had, their own jobs. Quite a lot of the people were probably nurses. So I put myself forward. And I remember when I finally got to my assessment, I was very borderline, and they decided not to put me forward. So I had to sort of do a little bit more training and sort of, as it were, reset my assessment, which is actually a complete role play of what I'm doing on this particular evening. And I remember I got getting into the role play, and then just it isn't freeze, I just dried up. And so it's quite an interesting process happening, because you're being videoed as well. It's not like you've just got one person in the room that you're role playing with. You know that there's somewhere in this room there's a camera which is filming you. And I just sort of dry up. And I said to whoever the person was I was role playing with, one of our trainers, I don't think I can go on. And then she must have said something to me, I can't remember what. And then I just found myself suddenly coming out of somewhere and into almost like a complete state of being is, an exaggeration, but something else started happening. And I found myself just re-engaging with this whole process that I'd been trained to do for the last 2 or 3 months. And sort of we got through to the end of the role playing, and I sort of knew actually, you can sort of tell when you've, in those sort of terms, when you sort of succeeded, and so I was accepted. So so there I am with this lady at this first meeting, and I'd ascertained whatever it was, what the problems were, and we'd agreed that we would meet again, probably the following week. And so the following week takes me down to Docklands again, and we're talking, and we're going into what's happened in more detail. And as far as I can remember, what it turns out was that her husband basically had not really talked to her when he was dying. So he'd been going through this, perhaps a long drawn-out process, but he hadn't really communicated what it was like for him to go through that. So she was left, and then suddenly he was dead, and she's just sort of left there. So at this point, I asked the sort of $64,000 question, which was something along the lines of, and how did you feel about that? And she sort of looked at me, and I can remember quite clearly, one word that I can remember from that meeting 30 odd years ago. She looked at me and she said, "Shanti, bitter." I thought, really bitter. And suddenly all this pent up emotion just sort of poured out of her. And it was the beginning of her change. Basically, I stood by listening to her and actually pitching just the appropriate question just at the right moment, had sort of unlocked what was holding it back. And she was able for the first time in several months to express to somebody what had been going on for her internally. And yeah, I mean, it wasn't, in a sense, it wasn't a spiritual transformation in a sort of Buddhist sense, but it sort of put her back, it returned to something like her normal life. I think I met her again once more, just to sort of check out that everything was going fine, but that was it. So it was almost like a sort of bit of magic, really, just being able to listen to somebody and then just being able to time the question, just at the right, a critical question, quite a dangerous question as well, to sort of ask somebody that you don't really know that well, how they felt about something that as big as the husband dying is, anyway, so luckily it worked, and it was just the trigger she needed to be able to move on. So I guess that was probably, it's not the first time I've obviously ever listened to anybody, but maybe it's the first time in my life I've really listened to somebody and it had such an obvious and an immediate impact. So I guess from that moment, you know, the whole area of communication, as Michael Sarah was saying, has been really important to me. And subsequently, some years later, I trained up in quite a slightly different area, in the restorative justice area, and was working with offenders and victims of offences. But that's another story. Anyway, I thought to leave that story just to give that as an example of how listening, maybe just tentatively, a sort of a deeper listening, can actually affect a really significant effect on another person, and maybe even on yourself. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and take you on a bit of a journey through the Buddhist angle on speech, on communication. I'm going to try and look at listening a bit deeper and suggest how listening, maybe in its own right, can be a bit of a spiritual practice and can actually perhaps at least nudge us, if not even sort of help move us in the direction of awakening. I'm going to suggest that with as listening deepens, and I'll say now, I think listening is not an either or. It's an open-ended communication, open-ended phenomena, shall we say. And I think at the sort of really open end, I think it can lead to a sort of a real deep receptivity to other people. And I'm going to propose that maybe an aspect of the awakened ones is that they have a deep receptivity, or potentially at least a deep receptivity to other beings. And I'm going to give you an example of that, and then we'll close. And we'll try and squeeze that in the next while. I think we might be pushing half an hour, that's right. So I'll skate over, there were some areas I was going to touch on, but I'm aware that also Naga Devi obviously gave a talk last week, which a sort of broader introduction to speech in particular. So I'm going to skate over those on the basis that actually it was covered to some extent last week. And also a lot of the things to do with speech are obviously included in books and other writings. So I'll refer you to those. So, yeah, maybe just a broader observation though, that in the Buddhist world, we have what we would call precepts. And I guess you're all familiar to some extent, at least, with the precepts. I just want to remind you that in the way that they're phrased, particularly in the Pali, if you do a literal translation from Pali into English, they mean something like, I undertake the training principle of. So precepts are very much about training principles. So there are sort of spiritual advice, say from the enlightened ones, to us relatively unenlightened about how we behave. So they're not really rules or laws, regulations. They're very much about things that we can practice, training principles. So I'm not encouraging you to file up on your practice, but if you do, you can always come back. They're training principles. You can always come back to the trainings. So just very briefly, the Buddhist tradition and in the True Ratner order itself, rather than the usual one speech precept that's used throughout the Buddhist world, we take 4 speech precepts. So the first is to do with, we usually use the term truth, but I'm just going to change the term for the benefit of this talk, and I'm going to talk about dishonesty. So we try to refrain from dishonesty. So dishonesty about things, about ourselves, about other people. We refrain from harmful speech. we refrain from useless speech, and we refrain from divisive speech. Divisiveness is almost like antithetical to the spiritual life, I think, in a way, because I think it separates people from people. It separates you from others, others from you. So I think it's not antithetical to the idea of Sangha in particular, divisive speech. So really one to be avoided. So those are the things to work on, to refrain from engaging in. But on the other hand, we can obviously, there's the positive angle, and there's sort of positive dimensions to speech and communication. So we can obviously be honest, being honest, you can be honest to yourself about yourself, show yourself to yourself, show yourself to others. And eventually, I think honesty in itself can lead in the direction of what I'm going to call truth with a capital T, i.e. truth, which is almost like synonymous with enlightenment, with awakening itself. So honesty leading to sort of truth on sort of quite a mundane level, leading to, and as we develop, having a more and more deeper understanding of the way things are, the truth of the way things are. So our speech can be kindly, it can be affectionate, and so that can be both in public when we're talking about ourselves or about other people, and in private. So we don't want to be hypocritical and praise someone in public but not in private. So it's across the board using affectionate speech. So imbuing, we did the metabolism practice slightly earlier. We can imbue our speech with loving kindness. Our speech, when we're engaging with suffering, in the sense that I was with the widow, is our speech can become compassionate. Another really important aspect of speech, and one that we practice or try to practice in true writing, is rejoicing in merit. So just seeing the people's qualities and really rejoicing in those. And that's a sort of unconditional. There's no sort of comeback here. You rejoice in someone else's merits because you see their merits for what they are, and you just openly rejoice in their merits. So it's not, not self-oriented. So speech can also be, hopefully, is useful. And just reminder, I think there's a story, I can tell it very, very quickly, in the Pali Canon, where I think the Buddha is represented as going into a gathering of relatively junior monks, and they're all sort of nattering, as it were, and probably the men, and they're probably talking about which local king or warrior has got the best chariots and so on and so forth. And in the end, the Buddha can't take any more of this, and he gets off and just can't take it anymore, just gets off and walks away. And I think he walks into the forest, and eventually he bumps into an elephant, this big male elephant, who's looking rather dejectedly, and they have a bit of a chat together, as it were. And the Buddha tells him his story about these junior monks sort of chattering away, and they can't get word in edgeways, and the elephant sort of says, as it were, tell me about it. So so beware of useless speech. I think sometimes talking more superficially does have its purpose, and it can be a bit of an icebreaker. And I think when I was doing my restorative work, when I used to go and visit someone who had been a victim of an offence in their home, I wouldn't sort of go straight in and say, well, what happened? I would probably just talk to them. I might ask them about how long they lived in the area, what they did for a living, just to sort of get to know them a bit, and just as a bit of an icebreaker. So, the more, as it were, superficial levels do have their place, but just to be wary of just engaging on the superficial especially when it's of real no use whatsoever. Yeah, so moving from the useless to something that's really useful, something that's practical for yourself or for other people. And maybe one of the most practical things you can do is help clarify a situation for someone. Often, especially when situations are complex, say in something like a relationship or some sort of complicated work issue or whatever it might be, people can often get really confused. I mean, they're surrounded by maybe conflicting elements. So one thing you can do is perhaps actually, by listening to them and asking appropriate questions, is actually clarify for them what the real issues are so that they can make their own decision. So it's one of the things that we used to talk about very much in the restorative world. It's in a way like empowering people to make their own decisions, not coming up with solutions. Yeah, and clarifying the situation so people can see for themselves what the issues are and can work out a way forward. So there's some other considerations. So I'm going to suggest also one aspect of good communication is to try and be intelligent. So I'm going to subsume some of these points under the sort of general banner of intelligence. So, first thing, when you're communicating with someone, or someone have something to communicate, you might be well worth considering: is this for the well-being of the other person? So this is quite a critical thing. Is it for their benefit or not? Is it really going to help them? Is it going to help them deal with some immediate issue, some psychological problem that they have, or is it going to help them eventually in the direction of awakening? So a consideration: is it promoting someone else's well-being? Is it appropriate? And there might be issues to do with age or maturity. There might be issues to do with something like confidentiality. And there's probably other things you might think about as well. Sometimes things are it's just not appropriate to talk to someone or about a particular issue. And then there's the issue of timeliness. Just considering, is this the right time? So on the one hand, not using this to one's own advantage, i.e., I'm going to pick a time when I can say something because it suits me, but actually, what's the benefit of the other person or the other people? So is it timely? And I hope Andrew won't mind me mentioning, he was telling us the other day about a spell he'd had in hospital when he was having some interactions with some of the staff, and I think one interaction was difficult, shall we say, but actually he didn't react. He could quite easily react to what was going on, but didn't react. Just listened to what the person had to say, and then said something. So it's actually just not being reactive, listening, actually hearing what the other person maybe got to say, and then coming forward if it's appropriate and if it's timely. And of course, is what you've got to say true? Is it true in the sense of, is it honest? Is it true in the sense, does it accord in any way with what we might call reality, the way things are? And there's another area which was just not relevant at the time of the Buddha. So you can find some of these points in the Pali Canon, but nowadays we have all manner of different methods of so-called communication, like electronic communication and so on and so forth. So I've come up with a bit of a hierarchy, and it's an inverse hierarchy, which is texting, Facebook and the like, telephone, Zoom / Skype, and face-to-face. So I no doubt we all engage in these methods of communication to some extent. And some of these methods of communication can be much more nuanced than others. So a verbal communication is often much more nuanced than something that you put in writing. Writing can actually perhaps be much more difficult to really communicate. And the trouble is with electronic communications, it just seems so easy. And we've all become writers nowadays, haven't we? Anybody who's got a mobile phone which has got texting on it, or a computer, or both, you write all the time. So we're writing to the universe, as it were. So I think it can be much more difficult to have a really nuanced communication by writing. So a friend of mine called Penny Cato has been writing a book about, and it involves one part of it about electronic communication. And he suggests that if you have an issue with somebody that at one of those lower levels, say you've had a text interaction which has gone badly wrong, and actually just to sort of take stock and think, actually, we can't resolve this issue at this particular level, say at the level of texting. So you go up a level, or you maybe got several levels. You realise that actually the only way to really overcome a difference is by going to one of these other levels. And I think Maitreya had an example of this with her own life a couple of months ago, when she felt that there was some tension between her and somebody else, and rather than sort of pinging off an email or whatever it was, she contacted the person and said, can we have a chat? So they had a chat on the phone or by Zoom, whatever it was. And actually, although they didn't actually necessarily see eye to eye or agree with things, they communicated, or they got on. It was a harmonious discussion. So just I'll leave that with you. If communication is nuanced, and the more like a face-to-face communication can be more nuanced than something as basic as like texting. It's another area of communication we've kind of really got time just to touch on, which is what you might call exoteric versus esoteric communication. So in the old days, when Bhante Sangha was still alive, people would often go and see him, and often they would come back, and the word would go around, Bhante says, and it'd be, Bhante says ... He'd make some apparent pronouncement on some subject, and everyone would go off and say, all right, well, Bhante says we should do this. And then a while later, someone else would go and see Bhante, and they would come back and say, well, Bhante says this, and it would seem to be completely conflicting at times. So you'd all have to sort of do about turn and do something else. So I think what was happening, well, maybe he changed his mind, of course. Guys, we are entitled to change our minds on issues. But the other thing is that maybe when people go to see, we're going to see Bhante personally, and when people talk to you, particularly about personal issues, they are often personal issues. And you can apply, Buddhist principles on a broader, in a broader sense. You can say apply the precepts or whatever. But when it comes down to someone's actual individual situation, again, that's a bit more nuanced. That's a bit more complex. So what you might need to do, you might say, well, in your case, given what you're saying, I think it might be appropriate to think about doing this. And it's like a teaching, as it were, or a suggestion to that person. It's not for the world at large, it's for that person. So if you're talking to an order member and they make a suggestion, just bear that in mind, that maybe it's just you they're talking to about your own individual situation. And it's not like everybody else is wrong, they should all do the same. So just, again, it's something just to think about, apply awareness, apply mindfulness to. Is something being said to you in that exoteric sense, this is appropriate to everybody, or is it something that's really just relevant to you in your particular situation at this time? because things change as well. Our lives change, our situations change. And so maybe the advice might change with time as well. So again, to be open to that, advice is appropriate for a given situation, as it were, at a given time. So, listening. So there's broadly two sorts of listening, I guess you say. There's passive listening, which is either virtually nothing or at best just actually hearing what somebody is saying. And then there's the more active aspects of listening. And active listening really involves a lot of things. I'm going to have to shoot through these quite quickly, unfortunately. But one thing you can do is actually show interest. It sounds quite basic, doesn't it? But actually show interest in what someone's saying, what they're trying to communicate to you. Show that you're hearing what they're saying. Try and establish some good eye contact with them. And that doesn't mean staring, obviously. Staring is actually is non-communication. You want a friendliness to when we're engaging with other people. So good eye contact. Now, I was thinking, maybe as a bit of an example, one from the world of photography and world of art. If you look at a good portrait of somebody, if you look at their eyes closely, you see they have lights in their eyes. And when you look at somebody who's alive, they almost invariably have lights in their eyes. Are you aware of that light in their eyes? They're called catch lights. That's the technical phrase. Are you aware of someone with the catch light in somebody's eyes? Because if you are, that probably means you're looking at their eyes. So do try and engage with people's eyes, but don't stare. Be aware of posture. How is the other person? Are they open? Or are they sort of scrunched up? What's your own posture like? Are you expressing openness? Are you expressing a certain alertness to what the other person is saying? Does your posture express engagement? But don't allow your posture to be confrontational. Sometimes when I don't do it so much nowadays, but if I'm actually interviewing somebody, if I have a chance, if it's just me and that other person, I usually arrange the chairs in a certain fashion. So if I was going to interview Nick, for instance, who is not sitting on a chair now, but I wouldn't sit front facing him face on, because that would be quite confrontational. I would very subtly change the position of my chair, so it's just slightly off centre, and I'd do the same with him. So we're just engaging very slightly in that way. Can you repeat or summarise what somebody has been saying to you? This is one of the things that we spent so much time when I was doing my bereavement counselling training. This is what we spent a lot of our time doing, is actually listening. We were role-playing, listening to what the other person was saying, and then feeding that back, summarising, feeding back, but actually also finding the correct emotional pitch. And a suggestion here, if you try this, don't be too afraid of making a mistake. Because sometimes if you're really communicating with somebody and you misjudge the emotional pitch of what they're trying to say, they will come back. Yeah. So and they will correct you, and they'll be quite friendly. They might say, "No, I don't mean that. I mean this," and you'll say, "Fine." So don't be afraid of actually guessing. And this is one of the things that we did quite a lot in our training, was to actually, try and guess an appropriate emotional pitch level that somebody was coming from. Another important thing you can do is reframing. So often people might put someone might put something over in quite a negative sense, and often if you're astute, you can change that round and say exactly the same thing, but reframe it in a positive way. So, for instance, someone might say to you that, say to someone who's like quite depressed, they might say to you, well, the only reason actually I'm carrying on is because of the children. And that's sort of putting it in sort of negatively. But you can turn that round and you can say, well, so what you're saying is you really value your children, and they value you as your parent, as their parent. And so, I mean, you sort of turn it round and you look for something positive in something, you turn it round, and suddenly maybe they can just see that actually what's really important to them, what's really important is that they're valuing in this example their family, their kids, or whatever it might be. And then, of course, there's silence. So if you can, not to be afraid of silence. I think, I think it's a famous saying in music that it's the gaps between the notes that are really important. So sometimes gaps between words or statements can be really important in communication. It's so tempting to jump in, isn't it? I don't know if you ever see that in yourself. Someone's saying something and you know exactly what's got to be said. You want to jump in, or they just stop. They're not quite sure what to say, and you can't bear the silence. You can't bear the silence. But actually, time to do is just to sit back and just give them. It might only just be a few moments, just space, just to collect their thoughts, and then come forward, and maybe you can just comment something. So don't be afraid in communication. Silences are not necessarily negative; they can be quite positive things. Yeah, and beware. I would suggest to beware of advice to people, and I think there's perhaps. I suggest there's an inverse relationship between giving advice and complexity. So the more complex a situation is that's been described to you, perhaps the less relevant or more dangerous it is to give advice, because you just don't. It's very difficult to really know the true complexities. So what you can do is actually just try and help clarify a situation. So that's perhaps the most useful thing you can do. And as I said a bit earlier, when you feel that you've got good communication, you can take risks. I think I was doing a mediation last year and working with Maitreya, and afterwards we were sort of debriefing, and I think she was a bit surprised at a question I asked. She thought it was almost a bit dangerous because she wouldn't have risked it, but as my sense was that it was an appropriate time to ask a particular question. And it's the sort of question, again, that can be an icebreaker. It can really open up, in the best sense of the term, issues. Maybe I should start timing. So I think with listening, so I suggested earlier, it can be quite an open-ended, open-ended quality, open-ended dynamic, and can lead to deep receptivity, such that you actually really take in somebody with your whole being. Communication is not just about what comes in through your ears or what you see. There's other things that happen. At times there might be touch. It might be appropriate when you're somebody, especially if they're upset, to hold their hand, and you have a sense of how the person actually literally feels, for instance. The other really important thing, and I think what can start leading it into a more spiritual dimension, is suspending your own ideas and views. You know, often when we're talking to somebody, they're talking, but at the same time you've got something running through your own head. You know, it's probably, I guess we all have that happening to us. You know, whatever your own little inner voice is commenting on what they're saying, or maybe it's even thinking about something else completely, and you pretend to be listening. So good listening is when you are actually really engaged, but you start to suspend your own thinking process, your own ideas, and really engage with what that person's saying. And I think if you can do that, you can start to maybe even address your own, in Buddhism they call them samskaras, your own habitual patterns. Maybe they become a bit more obvious to you, how you're relating to what somebody else is saying. Put it aside, try and suspend it, see it for what it is. And that allows you to start developing and allows the other person to start developing in a more spiritual sense as well. So I think if you can start doing that, then that's when it starts becoming really open-ended, as I was suggesting, and it can pass into a real receptivity.